Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So today, our mission is an extensive, highly granular analysis of Chapter 6 of Nāgārjuna's foundational text, the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, or just the MMK.
Right, the chapter titled An Examination of Desire and the Desirous.
Exactly. And because you, our listener, have been with us through the journey of the first 5 chapters, we're really operating on an advanced baseline today. You already understand how Nāgārjuna deconstructs things like causality, motion, perception, the aggregates, and all those physical elements.
Yeah, you got the groundwork down.
Right. So we are going to be pulling from a pretty massive stack of sources today. We're talking translated verses and analytical essays from scholars like J. Garfield, Stephen Batchelor, Frederick Strang, and the Madhyamaka translation group.
Some really heavyweight material.
Truly. We are taking the rigorous, relentless logic of Madhyamaka philosophy and applying it to a very specific target. We're looking at the triad of the mind, specifically the relationship of consciousness to its own mental factors.
And this is, it's just a critical pivot in the text. I mean, we've spent so much time looking outward at how the universe is constructed. Or, well, rather how it isn't constructed.
Right, the external stuff.
Exactly. But now we are turning that exact same diagnostic machinery inward.
And that completely changes the stakes, doesn't it? I mean, usually when we talk about a diagnostic tool, like, say, a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Yeah, it's very mechanical.
Like engineering, right?
Right.
You break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black background, and the doctor just points and says, there it is. There's the problem.
It is comforting in its binary nature, you know, broken or not broken. It's visible, it's solid, and it can be neatly categorized into a treatment plan.
Right.
And we as humans desperately want our internal lives to be that visible. We want them to be that easily categorized.
But then you step into the world of the mind, you step into neurodevelopment, trauma, psychology, and just your own subjective experience of an emotion.
Which is incredibly messy.
Utterly messy. Suddenly, that physical x-ray machine is useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. It feels like a storm of impulses and reactions.
So what do we do?
Right, what do? We try to build a psychological x-ray machine. We try to map the mind. And that is exactly what the prevailing philosophical and psychological school of the Nāgārjuna's time, the Abhidharma, was trying to do.
The Abhidharma was basically the premier cognitive science of its day. And to understand why Nāgārjuna is attacking it so fiercely in Chapter 6, we really need to understand the architecture they built.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So when the mind looks at itself, the Abhidharma posits that it naturally and accurately constructs what we call a triad of relational action.
A triad.
Right. They believe they had found the fundamental, irreducible building blocks of consciousness.
Like the periodic table of the mind?
Precisely. And in this specific context of Chapter 6, they define 3 distinct spheres of this triad. First, you have what we'll call opposite one.
Opposite one, okay.
This is the successive moment of consciousness itself. It's the subject, the one who desires. And the Sanskrit term used here is RAKTA.
RAKTA. So the agent experiencing the moment, the desirer.
Exactly. Then you have opposite 2, which represents the concomitant mental factors, the specific flavor or the coloring of that consciousness.
And in this chapter, the primary example is desire itself, right?
Yes, raga. This could also be anger or jealousy or compassion, but Nāgārjuna uses desire as the ultimate case study.
Okay, so we have the desirer, RAKTA, and we have the desire, RAGA.
And finally, you have the third sphere. This is the relation between them, the action or the link that binds the consciousness to the mental factor.
The glue.
Basically, yeah. The Abhidharma calls this concomitance or union. The Sanskrit term is saha for concomitance, meaning they arise together simultaneously. This is as opposed to pṛthak, which means separate.
I want to pause here because we really need to appreciate the sheer audacity of what Nāgārjuna is doing. I mean, we spent the last 5 chapters dismantling the physical and perceptual world. We proved that a seed isn't inherently a seed, and motion doesn't inherently exist.
We completely dissolve the boundary between a goer and the action of going.
Right. But now he is going after the very software of our minds. If you thought deconstructing a physical object was wild, dissolving the boundary between you and your desires feels, well, it feels intensely personal.
It is supposed to feel personal. The Abhidharma framework isn't just a dry academic theory, right? It describes exactly how you and I intuitively feel when we experience a strong emotion.
It matches our subjective experience.
Exactly. The Abhidharma claims that the mind is not just a messy, fluid soup. It posits that there are discrete, successive moments of consciousness, and these moments are accompanied by these concomitant mental factors.
And the sources get super specific about this, don't they?
Oh, very. Some sources mention there are 52 specific factors of consciousness that pair with 121 types of consciousness.
Wow. So it really is a highly structured taxonomy. In this view, a moment of consciousness, the desirer, and its mental factor, the desire, are absolutely irreducible.
Right.
They arise simultaneously. They sort of boot up together in the same millisecond as distinct, highly real, inherent entities.
And that right there is the core of the Abhidharma trap. They are saying these are separate entities that perfectly coincide.
And this is where I start to struggle a bit, or at least where I feel the need to push back on Nāgārjuna's behalf for a second.
Sure, play devil's advocate.
Let's say I'm sitting at my desk and I feel a sudden, intense craving for a cup of coffee. The Abhidharma says that in that specific millisecond, a distinct entity called my consciousness and a distinct entity called desire for coffee launch together, perfectly paired.
Like an operating system and a specific application booting up simultaneously.
Exactly. If they arise at the exact same time and function together perfectly, why does Nāgārjuna have a problem with that? I mean, isn't that just a highly functional, accurate description of a human mood?
Well, because we have to separate conventional functionality from absolute ontology. That's the key. Nāgārjuna never denies that you feel the desire for coffee.
Okay, that's a relief.
Right. He isn't saying the conventional experience of wanting something is a lie. The issue is that the Abhidharma isn't merely saying these two things function together in a practical sense.
They're going further than that.
Much further. They are making a massive ontological leap. They are claiming that the consciousness and the mental factor are inherently existent elements.
And inherently existent.
Yes. They're claiming these spheres exist absolutely from their own side, with their own independent, intrinsic essence, and yet they somehow perfectly coincide in reality.
They possess their own intrinsic essence. They are like solid atoms of psychology.
Yes, psychological atoms. And this rigid dualistic categorization is what Nāgārjuna diagnoses as the profound disease of reification.
The disease of reification. I like that phrase.
It's crucial. It is one thing for an advanced practitioner to realize that a physical object, like a table, is empty of inherent existence. It is relatively easy to look at a wooden table and intellectually accept that it's just a temporary arrangement of wood, nails, and human conceptualization.
Right, sure. We can all get there intellectually.
But it is a much more difficult, much more insidious problem when the human mind turns inward and clings desperately to its own internal states as absolute reality.
We reify our own software. We turn our fleeting thoughts into solid, permanent objects.
We do it constantly. The mind automatically and aggressively slices reality into an actor, an action, and an object. It creates the desirer as a solid, permanent self.
Right.
It creates the desire as a solid external force acting upon that self. And it creates the state of being bound by desire as a solid reality.
Let's dig into the psychological stakes of this for a moment. Why is this disease of reification so incredibly dangerous? If you're listening to this and thinking, okay, so what if I think my desire for coffee or my anger at a coworker is a solid, real thing? What is the actual cost of that belief?
The cost is endless suffering. Honestly, it is the engine of samsara.
That's a huge claim.
But it's true. As long as you believe that your consciousness and your desires are inherently real, solid entities, you are trapped. Think about the psychological experience of intense anger.
Okay, I'm with you.
If you believe your anger is a fundamentally real, independently existing entity that has invaded your mind, you only have two options.
Which are?
You can either identify with it completely, I'm an angry person, this is my fundamental nature, which leads to totally destructive behavior, or you can view it as an alien force that you have to violently suppress and fight against.
Which creates massive internal psychological friction and exhaustion. You're treating the emotion like a demon that literally exists inside the room with you. You're trying to wrestle a ghost because you've somehow convinced yourself it has physical mass.
That's a great way to put it. Nāgārjuna is acting as a spiritual physician here to cure this specific disease. He wants to show you that the ghost has no mass.
So the suffering comes from the wrestling.
Right. If you realize that the desirer and the desire lack any inherent solid foundation, the psychological grip they have on you completely dissolves. You still feel the emotion, but you don't reify it. You don't build an entire identity around it.
So if the Abhiharma's model of discrete, inherently real psychological atoms is the disease, how does the physician administer the cure? We have to take this entire psychological triad, right? The consciousness, the desire, and their concomitants.
Yes, and subject it to the heavy machinery of Madhyamaka logic. We have to run it through the tetralemma.
The fourfold negation. This is the absolute engine of the MMK.
It really is.
So we are going to walk through verses 1 through 9, and we are going to rigorously apply this logic to demonstrate that these three spheres cannot logically hold any of the extreme ontological positions we try to force them into.
Right. We will prove they cannot be existent, non-existent, both, or neither.
They cannot be different, identical, both, or neither.
And they cannot be separate, united, both, or neither.
It's exhausting just listing them. But let's start by attacking the temporal argument, the idea of existence versus non-existence over time, which Nāgārjuna tackles in verses 1 and 2.
Okay, let's do it.
We are asking a very simple sequence question. Does the desirer, the RAKTA, the moment of consciousness, exist prior to the desire, the rāga?
Let's look at how J. Garfield translates.
Yeah.
Verse 1, it reads, "If prior to desire and without desire there were a desirous one, desire would depend on him. Desire would exist when there is a desirous one."
Okay, notice how Nāgārjuna immediately corners the Abhiharma opponent there.
He really does.
The opponent wants to say that consciousness is the primary basis, the host, upon which the mental factor of desire depends. And honestly, it seems logical, right? You need a mind first before you can have a thought.
That's the intuitive trap.
But if you claim that the host, the moment of consciousness, exists inherently and prior to the mental factor, you create a complete logical absurdity. You are positing the absolute existence of a desirer who, in that specific prior moment, has absolutely no desire.
Right. That makes no sense.
Wait, let me just wrap my head around this. If my very definition, my inherent identity in this equation is the one who desires, how can I possibly exist before the desire arrives? It's a contradiction in terms.
It is.
So it would be like calling someone a husband 5 years before they ever meet their spouse. You can't be a husband without a spouse. The title, the definition of the entity, relies entirely on the relationship.
That is a perfect analogy. You cannot establish the independent existence of a relational entity outside of the relation. The Abhitarma wants to isolate the RAKTA as a solid thing that stands alone, waiting for the rāga to arrive.
Waiting on the platform for the train.
Exactly. But a desirer without a desire is logically incoherent.
And verse 2 hits the flip side of that temporal coin. Stephen Batchelor translates it as, if there were no desirous one, how could there be desire? The same follows for the desirous one, too, whether desire exists or not.
Right. If the desirer does not exist first, where does the desire occur? It cannot just float freely in a vacuum.
A rogue desire just wandering the streets.
Right. A mental factor and emotion cannot exist independently without a consciousness to experience it. You don't just have an isolated atom of anger floating down the street. It requires a subject.
Okay, I follow.
So you cannot have the desire preceding the desire, and you cannot have the desire preceding the desire.
Yes.
They cannot exist independently of one another in sequential time.
Okay, so if I'm the Abhiharma philosopher arguing with Nāgārjuna, I concede the temporal point. I say, fine, you got me. They don't precede each other. One doesn't wait for the other. They arise at the exact same time. They are strictly concomitant. They are simultaneous. Problem solved.
But that retreat leads them directly into an even more devastating logical trap.
The problem of identity versus difference.
Exactly, which Nāgārjuna dismantles
Right.
in verses 3 through 5. The opponent is now relying entirely on the concept of absolute concomitance, or saha. So Nāgārjuna asks a fundamentally devastating question.
Which is?
If they are concomitant, if they arise together, are they inherently identical to each other, or are they inherently different from each other?
Oof. Okay, let's tackle identity first. If consciousness and the mental factor of desire are absolutely inherently identical, well, the whole concept of concomitance instantly vanishes, doesn't it?
It does. Walk me through why that is. Why does identity destroy concomitance?
It's pure mathematics, really. Garfield's translation of verse 4 sums it up brilliantly. He says, in identity, there is no simultaneity. A thing is not simultaneous with itself.
Right.
If the desirer and the desire are exactly the same absolute entity, they can't coincide with one another. I can't be in a relationship with myself. I can't sit next to myself on a park bench.
Exactly. You need two things.
Right. For concomitance to exist, for two things to come together and interact, there must mathematically be two things. If you say they are absolutely identical, you collapse them into a singularity, and the relationship just disappears.
Precisely. Absolute identity destroys the possibility of a relationship. So the opponent, realizing that identity wipes out their complex taxonomy of the mind, frantically retreats to the opposite extreme.
They always do.
They say, okay, they are not identical. They are two distinct things. They are inherently different.
Yeah.
They are absolutely separate entities that just happen to arise in the same moment and coincide perfectly.
And here is where I really have to fight my own intuition, because my mind desperately wants to accept that compromise. It feels right. Okay, there are two different things, booting up at the same millisecond, locking together. Why doesn't that work? Why is Nāgārjuna so relentless against the idea of them being different?
Because we have to remember the strict definitions we are operating under. We are not talking about conventional casual difference. We are talking about inherent difference, absolute difference.
Right, the absolute ontology.
If two things possess their own completely independent, inherent self-sustaining essences, they are hermetically sealed from one another. Absolute difference means there is absolutely no intrinsic link, no overlap, no shared reality between them whatsoever.
I see. If they have no intrinsic link whatsoever, they could never seamlessly interact or coincide.
Let's look at how Frederick Strang translates the second half of verse 4. But yet, how will concomitants come into being if there are separate things? And then verse 5 really drives the nail in. If concomitants applied to separate things, then that one with concomitants would be that one without concomitants.
Okay, that language is incredibly dense. That one with concomitants would be that one without. What is he actually saying there?
He is pointing out the absurdity of absolute independence. If the consciousness and the desire are already fully established as separate independent things, they do not need each other to exist. They are complete in their isolation. Their essence is already perfectly formed. So why would they ever coincide? And if they did temporarily coincide, it wouldn't change their fundamental isolated nature. They would remain without concomitants, even while supposedly experiencing it.
Let me try a metaphor here to see if I'm tracking this. Let's use a chemical metaphor instead of the software one. Let's look at water, H2O.
Okay, I like where this is going.
If I ask whether the hydrogen and the oxygen in water are identical or different, if I say they are absolutely identical, I don't have a molecule. I just have one element. So identity fails.
Right. You lose the relationship that creates water.
But if I say they are absolutely inherently different, meaning they are perfectly sealed, independent realities that can never be penetrated or altered by anything else, then they can never bond. I just have isolated hydrogen gas and isolated oxygen gas floating in the same room.
They pass like ships in the night.
Yes. They have to surrender their absolute independence. They have to be vulnerable to each other to create the molecule of water. Absolute difference builds an impenetrable wall.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Think about what absolute separation means for your actual psychological experience. If the moment of your consciousness is absolutely, inherently separate from the feeling of desire, the consciousness could never actually feel the desire.
Oh, wow.
The desire could never actually color or influence the consciousness. They would be occupying two parallel universes that never touch. For a mental factor to affect your consciousness, there must be a porous boundary. There must be mutual conditioning.
So Nāgārjuna is proving that if you hold on to the idea of inherently real, separate mental atoms, your own mind could never actually function.
Exactly.
He is literally sealing every single conceptual exit in the room. He says they can't be the same and they can't be different. He is forcing the ego to exhaust itself.
And this exhaustion reaches its absolute peak when we look at the circularity of separation and union, which he covers in verses 6 through 9. Nāgārjuna exposes that the Abhidharma opponent is essentially arguing in circles, trying to prop up a failing system.
Let's look at Padmakar's translation of verse 8 to see this tautology in action. It says, if you claim they coincide because they're not established as two separate things, will you also claim that they are separate because they are established as coincident?
The opponent is desperately trying to use separation to prove concomitance, and then turning right around and using concomitance to prove separation.
That's wild.
They say, look, they must be separate entities because we clearly see them coinciding together as two distinct things in our mind. But then Nāgārjuna asks, well, how do you logically establish that they are coinciding in the first place? And the opponent replies, because we know they are separate things that have come together.
It's a dog chasing its own tail. You cannot logically prove A by using B as your foundation and then try to prove B by using A as your foundation when neither A nor B has any absolute reality of its own. It's like trying to build a bridge out of two clouds by leaning them against each other.
And this culminates in verse 9. Batchelor translates it as, since different things are not established, Coexistent things are not established. If there existed any different things, one could assert them as coexistent things.
Meaning, if you cannot establish that these psychological elements are inherently different, which we just proved you can't,
Yeah.
then you have absolutely no building blocks to establish that they exist together.
Not at all.
The entire massive, complex Abhidharma structure of these discrete, independent psychological atoms pairing up is just totally dismantled. It collapses under its own weight.
Which brings us to the grand conclusion of the tetralemma in verse 10, generalizing this finding for all phenomena. The Padmakara translation reads, "And all things, like desire, do not exist together, neither do they not exist together."
So we have just taken the X-ray machine of Madhyamaka logic and applied it to our own emotions. We have exhausted all 4 logical gates. These spheres aren't existent over time. They aren't non-existent.
Yep.
They aren't different. They aren't identical. They aren't both. They aren't neither. Absolute concomitance is a logical impossibility.
It's completely ruled out.
So if you're listening to this, you might be feeling a sense of vertigo. I know I am. If my consciousness isn't real and my desire isn't real and their relationship isn't real, what on earth is actually happening when I want a cup of coffee? What are we left with when the conceptual structure collapses?
We are left with the profound revelation of emptiness, sunyata. Because all extreme positions of inherent existence fail, we must conclude that these 3 spheres, the consciousness, the desire, and their concomitants, are entirely empty of inherent existence.
Okay, let's hover on that.
They are never absolute. Therefore, their concomitant, independent production is impossible.
If you're listening and thinking, wait, if my emotions are empty, does that mean they are worthless? Does that mean my love for my family or my passion for my career is just a nihilistic void? We have to clarify this deeply because this is where Western interpretations of Buddhism often go terribly wrong.
Right.
When Nāgārjuna says your desire is empty, he is absolutely not saying you don't feel it.
Right. Emptiness is not a nihilistic black hole. It is precisely the opposite. Emptiness is the necessary breathing room of the universe. It is the very quality that allows reality to function.
How so?
If the consciousness and the desire were not empty, if they were inherently real, solid, unchangeable entities like the Abhidharma claimed, they would be frozen. They could never interact. You could never actually experience the arising of a feeling. And more importantly, you could never, ever stop feeling it once it started.
Wow, okay. Let's apply that to the real world. If my desire for coffee was an absolute, inherent, permanent entity, it couldn't be altered. It would just sit in my mind screaming at me for eternity, regardless of whether I drank the coffee or not.
Exactly. It would be a nightmare.
The simple fact that a desire can arise from nowhere, peak in intensity, be experienced by my consciousness, and then completely fade away once the condition is met is absolute proof that it is empty of a permanent essence. Its fleeting nature is its emptiness.
Exactly. And this leads us directly to the necessary corollary of emptiness, dependent co-origination. From the realization of emptiness, we conclude that these 3 spheres are inseparable, dependently co-originated, interdependent, co-defined, and co-evolving.
They are mere designations, labels that our conceptualizing mind imputes onto a fluid process.
Yes. The RAKTA, the desirer, and the RAGA, the desire, define each other conceptually in the exact same way that left defines right, or light defines dark. One cannot exist without the other providing the contrast.
It's like the concept of parent and child that we've discussed in previous deep dives. You can be an adult human being for 30 years, but you cannot be a parent until the exact moment a child exists.
Perfect example.
The child defines the parent defines the child. They co-arise instantly in definition. You can't have half of the equation.
And this is a very important distinction to make regarding the logic of Chapter 6 versus what we saw in Chapter 1.
Oh, right. The physical causality.
Right. In Chapter 1, when Nāgārjuna analyzed physical causality, we looked at a temporal timeline. A seed becomes a sprout. There's a sequence of physical events. But here, with the internal architecture of the desirer and the desire, there is no causal timeline in that sense.
Because it's all instant.
It is conceptual co-definition. They arise simultaneously as a unified, momentary experience, completely dependent on one another for their very meaning.
But if there is no hard timeline, if they just co-arise instantly as empty concepts, how does this actually drive human behavior? How does this empty feedback loop keep us trapped in samsara? Why do we keep making the same mistakes?
Because while they co-arise instantly in definition, they also co-evolve across time, constantly updating the karmic continuum of the mind. And we should define what we mean by karma here, because it's not some mystical system of cosmic reward and punishment.
Right, it's not a scoreboard.
Think of karma more like neuroplasticity.
Behavioral momentum.
Exactly. Your consciousness feels a desire. Because you don't realize it is empty, you act on it. That action conditions the mind, which literally shapes the architecture of your next moment of consciousness.
So it writes the code for tomorrow?
Yes. That newly shaped consciousness will naturally give rise to new, perhaps stronger or more specific desires. It is the limitless, centerless, fractal loop. Every time you give in to an empty craving and treat it as real, you are literally writing new cognitive code that ensures that specific craving boots up faster and stronger tomorrow.
It's an endless feedback loop of self-reinforcing habits. But the crucial part, the hopeful part, is that it functions because it is empty.
Right.
If the software of your mind was hard-coded and unchangeable, if your anger was inherently real, no update could ever install. You could never learn, you could never heal from trauma, and you could never achieve enlightenment. Emptiness is what makes liberation mathematically possible.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of Madhyamaka thought, the realization that phenomena function dynamically purely because they are empty. This is the union of the two truths.
This is where Nāgārjuna bridges the gap between the profound philosophy and our messy everyday lives. Let's unpack this union. We have the first truth, which is conventional truth or dependent origination.
The world we live in.
Right. This is the world of causes, effects, desires, paying taxes, getting angry in traffic. And then we have the second truth, ultimate truth, which is emptiness. The total lack of inherent independent essence in any of those things.
The union of the two truths state that these are not two different realities competing with one another. We are not talking about a physical world versus a spiritual realm.
That's a common misconception.
It is. They are the exact same reality viewed from two different angles. The three spheres of our mental triad, the consciousness, the desire, the relationship, function conventionally precisely because they lack intrinsic substance. One truth supports, implies, and completely enables the other.
They're completely inextricable. You can't have dependent origination without emptiness, and you can't have emptiness without things dependently originating.
And because they are empty and dependently co-arisen, Nāgārjuna concludes that these mental spheres, these intense emotions we feel, are fundamentally like illusions.
The sources use some really evocative language here.
They do. The texts use beautiful metaphors. They're like reflections in a mirror, mirages in a desert, dreams or echoes. They are described as there, yet not there.
There, yet not there. That phrase perfectly captures the agonizing human experience of a strong emotion. When you are gripped by an intense desire, whether it is a desperate craving for a career promotion, a burning jealousy over a romantic partner, or even just intense road rage, it feels overwhelmingly there.
Oh, absolutely.
It dominates your entire neurobiology. Your heart rate spikes, your focus narrows, your muscles tense. In that moment, the anger or the desire feels like the most real, solid, undeniable thing in the universe.
It feels real because your nervous system's reacting to the conventional truth. But when you apply the Madhyamaka X-ray to that intense emotion and look for the solid, permanent core of that desire, you cannot find it.
It just vanishes.
It vanishes. It is what we call a karmic mirage. Our past actions, our evolutionary biology, our cultural conditioning, they all shape how our minds impute these rigid, absolute triads onto the fluid flow of reality. We project a solid me who desperately needs or hates a solid thing.
We fall for the mirage. Let's use the desert oasis analogy to really ground this concept of the two truths working together. If you are lost in a desert, dying of thirst, and you see a shimmering mirage of an oasis on the horizon, you will run toward it.
Naturally.
The exhaustion you feel in your legs from running is entirely real. The dehydration accelerating in your body is real. If you trip over a rock while running toward the mirage, the blood on your knee is real. The physiological effects of your belief are real in the first truth. But the oasis driving that entire chain of behavior, it is an optical illusion. It is empty.
That is a brilliant way to articulate it. The karma generated by chasing the desire, the exhaustion, the suffering, the behavioral patterns is profoundly real in a conventional sense. But the inherent existence of the desire itself is an illusion. A mirage of a brick wall will still result in a conventionally broken nose if you run into it head first.
I love that. But wait, if I realize it's a mirage, how do I even talk about it? If my very consciousness and my desires are optical illusions of the mind, how do we communicate?
It's a linguistic trap.
Right. Every time I try to talk about my feelings, I have to use nouns and verbs. I have to say, I am angry or I want this. Our language instantly forces us back into reifying these concepts. I am immediately trapped back in the disease.
This is the inherent limitation of human language, and it is where Nāgārjuna aggressively pushes us beyond our conceptual boundaries. We must use a generalized version of the tetralemma to transcend the framework entirely.
The generalized tetralemma.
Yes. We use this advanced logical tool to affirm that these three spheres, and indeed all phenomena, are not this, they are not non-this, they are not both, and they are not neither. And that holds true for whatever this happens to be.
Every time I reach for a cognitive raft to keep myself afloat, he sinks it. If I say my desire is real, Nāgārjuna destroys it. If I say my desire is fake or non-existent, he destroys that too, because a fake desire wouldn't make my heart race.
Right.
If I say I am separate from the universe, he proves I'm not. If I say I am one with the universe, he proves that's a conceptual extreme too. He constantly slaps my hand away from any conceptual resting place.
He pushes you to completely exhaust your conceptual framework. The ego relies on binary categorization to feel safe. The goal of this relentless deconstruction is to realize that ultimate reality transcends all conditioned, dualistic conceptual proliferations. Reality is not permanent. It is not impermanent. It is not continuous. It is not discontinuous.
It is incredibly frustrating at first. If you really sit with this logic, you feel like you are drowning because you have absolutely no conceptual raft to hold on to. But if you stay with it, if you let the exhaustion wash over you, there is a terrifying radical freedom on the other side.
There really is.
It completely kills the exhausting anxiety of trying to force the chaotic universe into neat binary boxes.
It forces the ego to surrender its desperate need to categorize, control, and solidify reality. You stop trying to drink the sand.
But practically speaking, this brings up a huge question. With the binary boxes destroyed and no conceptual raft, we still have to navigate the physical world. I still have to wake up, go to work, interact with my family, and I will inevitably still experience desires. I can't just float in a void of non-conceptuality. How do I live?
This brings us to the application of the middle way. Acting without acting.
Acting without acting, okay.
The conclusion of this analysis is that the absolute best attitude toward the mind and its mental factors is the middle way. This is a path totally free from all extreme views. It is free from this and non-this, and it is free from the middle ground of both or neither.
So it's completely unattached to any pole.
Exactly. It means recognizing with profound clarity that there is nothing in the universe to inherently accept and nothing to inherently reject.
So how do we use language and concepts if we know they are empty?
We use them conventionally, but never, ever in absolute terms. We act without acting. We use the concepts of desire, consciousness, self, and other as highly functional tools.
Like using a map while knowing it's not the actual territory.
Precisely. We use them without attachment, without reification, without effortful grasping, and without assigning an absolute life or death value to them because we now know their true, illusory nature.
So if I apply this to my daily life, it seems like Nāgārjuna is saying, I don't need to suppress my desire for a promotion at work. I don't need to run away to a cave and pretend I don't want things. I just need to stop believing that the me who gets the promotion is a permanent entity and that the promotion will finally provide lasting satisfaction. Is that the middle way?
That is exactly it. You engage with the conventional reality without being deceived by it. And this leads to perhaps the most radical statement in Mahayana Buddhism, which emerges naturally from this logic.
Which is?
Samsara and nirvana are the exact same world, just perceived differently.
Wait, unpack that, because usually we think of nirvana as some heavenly destination we escape to after we suffer enough in samsara.
That is a dualistic trap. Samsara, the cycle of suffering, craving, and ignorance, is not a different physical place than nirvana, the state of liberation and perfect enlightenment. Samsara is simply the act of grasping at the mirage as if it were real water. It is the act of reifying the desirer and the desire.
It's running toward the desert oasis, filling your mouth with sand and crying because it doesn't quench your thirst.
Yes. Nirvana, on the other hand, is living an entirely ordinary life in the exact same desert. It is chopping wood, carrying water, working a job, and yes, even experiencing the sudden arising of human desire. But you do it while being fully, continuously aware of its empty, co-arisen, illusory nature.
You see the mirage for what it is.
Right. You admire the beautiful optical effect of the light bending through the heat waves, but you don't run yourself to death trying to drink from it. You don't build your identity around acquiring the mirage.
You play the game fully aware it is a game. You act without the absolute weight of the acting crushing your soul. You use the tools of the mind without letting the tools use you.
Precisely. And when you achieve this state, when the rigid, heavily defended boundaries of the desirer and the desire finally dissolve through this analytical practice, something profound happens to your relationship with the rest of the world.
The boundaries start to fall away everywhere.
Yes. When your ego stops desperately defending its borders because it realizes it has no inherent borders, what happens to the boundary between the individual and the universe?
The ultimate dissolution. This brings us to the conclusion of Chapter 6, which is primordial unity and the end of duality.
When we deeply realize the emptiness of these internal spheres, we logically must extend that realization outward. We might as well perceive everything, including the consciousness, the mental factors, the individual, the collective society, and the entire cosmos as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, divine, and one.
But we have to be incredibly careful with that word one, don't we? Because it sounds like we're swinging back to a massive absolute identity.
Extremely careful. We mean this strictly in the non-dual sense. We do not mean one as a giant, homogeneous, single cosmic entity that swallows everything up into a gray soup.
Right, not a monolith.
Exactly. We mean not many, not one, not both, not neither. It is a realization that absolute concomitance and absolute non-concomitance are impossible anywhere in the universe. Reality is far beyond such rigid, static dualities.
The perceiver, the consciousness, and the perceived world are intimately co-creating each other every single microsecond. There is no hard border between the individual consciousness and the cosmos.
Think about the individual, the collective, and the cosmos as an indivisible vibrating web. Your RAKTA, your individual moment of consciousness, is shaped by your RAGA, your desires. But where do your desires come from?
They come from everything else.
They are heavily conditioned by collective, societal desires. What your culture tells you to want, what advertisements tell you is valuable, and this collective human experience is embedded deeply in the cosmic web of space, time, and biology.
It's all connected.
You cannot logically separate a single fleeting moment of human craving from the entire history of the universe that conditioned it to arise in that specific way.
It is truly breathtaking when you look at the scale of what Nāgārjuna has done here. I am marveling at this progression. We started this deep dive by analyzing a tiny, discrete, microscopic moment of psychological desire, a single fleeting craving in a single human mind.
Just a spark.
Right. And by rigorously proving that this tiny moment cannot exist independently, we unraveled the boundary between the self and the entire universe.
Because the logic is holographic.
Yeah.
The emptiness of a single moment of desire contains the emptiness of the entire cosmos. When you realize that the desirer and the desire are interdependent, co-emergent illusions, the illusion of a separate, isolated self, locked in a desperate struggle against an antagonistic universe, completely collapses.
And this raises a vital point about how we treat others in this framework. Compassion arises naturally here, not out of some heavy moral obligation, not out of guilt, and not as a commandment from on high, but purely out of inexorable logic.
Right, it just makes logical sense.
If the idea of an isolated, independent self is revealed as a logical absurdity, then selfishness is equally absurd.
It is like a left hand saving a right hand from a fire. The left hand doesn't need to read a moral philosophy textbook to pull the right hand back from the flame. It does it naturally, instantly, because while the boundary between left hand and right hand is a useful conventional designation, they share the exact same nervous system.
I love that analogy.
When the absolute boundaries of the self dissolve into emptiness, you realize you share the same interdependent, co-arising web with all beings. To harm them is quite literally to harm the web that sustains you.
Let's do a quick recap of the massive journey we just took. We started with the Abhidharma's rigid, heavy triad of the consciousness, the desire, and their concomitants, the X-ray of the mind.
The false X-ray.
Exactly. We took that triad and we smashed it against the unyielding walls of the tetralemma, proving that these psychological elements couldn't be inherently identical, different, existent, or non-existent. We discovered the profound, liberating freedom of emptiness and dependent co-origination.
And we united the two truths.
Right, learning to see the emotional world as a highly functional karmic mirage. And finally, we arrived at the middle way, learning how to act without acting in a non-dual reality where the self and the cosmos are inextricably, perfectly intertwined.
We took the X-ray of the mind, we looked for the solid bones of our identity, and we found that there are no solid bones. The mind is made of light and relationships and constant fluid flux. And there is immense peace in that realization.
Before we let you go, our sources provide one final, lingering application of this logic. a provocative thought that extrapolates from the source material's deconstruction of time, which is heavily contextualized later in Chapter 19 of the MMK, but applies perfectly to the mind right now.
Consider this as you go about your day. We just spent this entire deep dive deconstructing your very identity and your deepest desires into an empty, co-evolving mirage. But apply that exact same Madhyamaka X-ray to your sense of time.
Time itself.
Yes, your entire concept of past, present, and future is also just another conceptual triad completely lacking inherent existence. The past is an empty echo that no longer exists anywhere except in your mind. The future is an unwritten illusion that hasn't happened yet. And the present is a centerless, fleeting moment that cannot even be pinned down before it vanishes.
So, if the past is merely an empty echo and the future is just an unwritten illusion, what happens to your crushing regrets about what you did yesterday and your heavy, paralyzing anxieties about what will happen tomorrow when you realize that now is the only illusion you ever actually have to work with?
The crushing burden of time is just another reified concept. When you stop grasping at the past and the future as solid entities, the anxiety dissolves naturally into the middle way. You are free to simply act.
What a place to leave it. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the architecture of your own mind. We encourage you to step out into your primordially perfect, dependently originated day. Look around you, experience your desires, feel your emotions, do your work, live your life, but remember to see the mirage for what it truly is. And remember, the murky, muddy waters of your internal life aren't something to be feared or violently suppressed. When you stop trying to force an absolute solid X-ray to read them, you might just realize how beautifully and freely they flow.